We are back with episode 9 of the Three Body Problem. I'm here with my friends Juanito and Costin. Costin, checking in from Taiwan after your big HitCon keynote. What was that, today?
Yeah, just a couple of hours ago, I think.
How did that go?
It's always difficult when you speak at a conference in a new location. Let's say you're maybe not familiar with the event, you don't know what kind of people are coming, so it's always a bit tricky to try to cater to the audience, if you want. Should the content be technical? Should it be like more non-technical? My case, what I always like count on the fact that funny content works everywhere. So if you tell jokes, even if nobody laughs, it should be successful.
Yeah, it works. One of the things I like to do when I go to international conferences, kind of get a feel for the vibe on the ground among security researchers, people on the ground, and so on. Obviously, we're here in the West, and you know, the noise out of Taiwan, China is around, you know, a looming invasion and a lot of noise. What is the vibe on the ground there? Did you get a chance to kind of hang out with some of these Taiwanese researchers? Like, what is the scene there like?
I did actually. Last night we went to a place called the Hacker Bar, which is like a really interesting location. One of the founders of HitCon started the Hacker Bar a couple of years ago, and different hackers, you know, passed and left their marks, like graffiti on the walls. There's shellcode on the tables, which I posted on X as a challenge earlier today. And I did ask, like, what's the feeling here? What do people think about it? And the answer was a bit surprising. They said, like, generally people in America worry a lot more than us. Over here, like, we don't care too much. We don't worry too much. But we do see that people in America, whenever they come here, they always ask about the same questions. They seem to be very worried. So
and the Ukrainians weren't worried either. Pre-invasion Ukrainians weren't entirely worried when the West was...
I don't know that that's a big win, right? Like, we're like, I don't know that that's a very comforting thought.
No, it's fascinating that when you're underground and you're in the midst of it, it doesn't feel as tension-filled as it is. I've always had the Israelis say, you know, we're so used to living in this conflict mentality that it doesn't feel as real as it probably feels to you from the outside. So maybe there's a little bit of that.
Possible. Or I think also maybe the media also greatly inflates the problem or the issue. And I think on one hand that's important because you want to get support, you're going to get funding, you want to be able to send money and help to Ukraine, to Taiwan, of course. And this kind of public perception matters a lot, especially in the United States. So yeah, it's important to explain the threat in a way.
Are those conferences? Sorry, Juan. I'll get. I just want to listen. Get some feel from what Costin is experiencing there. Are those conferences considered open, where guys can come and share anti-Chinese research, Chinese discoveries of APTs? Like, how would you define like?
It's but it's like I think it's an interesting discussion, and I did talk to a couple of APT researchers here who are saying that they used to be very good friends with Chinese companies and they were sharing research, and things maybe changed around 2015, 2016. That is when they started, drifting apart, if you want. But they used to be, good friends and working together. Nowadays, there's a lot of Chinese APT research coming out of Taiwan. Even at HitCon, there will be a couple of talks on this topic. In particular, I know several researchers who are going to present tomorrow, including, I think, some former colleagues of ours. I would say that people here, they're definitely like probably number one priority in terms of APTs. Targeting Taiwan is for sure, it's China. So also the kind of level of knowledge they have about this topic is also formidable.
Juan, how are you, my friend?
Good, man. I happy to be home for at least a week. I could actually kind of settle my thinking and sort of preparing for LABScon and trying to actually getting advice from you to try to get some perspective, because I have to do a talk. I said I would do a talk, and you've been giving me some interesting advice around what to conceptualize, right? Like, in my thinking has been this sort of like old SaaS mentality about you got to come in and drop the biggest APT and have some amazing bit of news. And I think that might be, at least from
News are
what you're
dead, my friend.
describing, yeah, it's an old school type of thing. So I'm trying to get some perspective and do something that'll be more impactful and valuable to today's landscape. But let's see. I'm meditating on it.
While we were on LABScon, you had a handful of new announcements since last week, including the addition of Dr. Cristina Cifuentes to the agenda. You saw her talk at Recon. What can the folks expect? Why is this a big deal?
So I've been trying to get her over to LabsCon since last year, and I'm thrilled that we could finally make it happen. For folks who may not know, Dr. Cifuentes is known as the mother of decompilation. Her master's thesis 30 years ago essentially created the paradigm of decompilation. And it's funny because she's moved on to have a very successful career in a sort of adjacent field. She's over at Oracle, and it's funny to see that someone could kind of casually create something so impactful that is such a key part of our industry. And then kind of go her merry way. But I think it's about time that we all kind of give her some recognition, give her flowers, and say thank you, and get some perspective from her. So I happen to know that the Recon talk was not recorded, and we had already been trying to get her to LabsCon, but it added this emphasis, even just for like the historical record of saying, hey, please come give us a slightly different version of that, and let's make sure that the world can actually have a copy of that speech. So I'm really, really looking forward to that.
And LabsCon, I understand, is almost sold out. I believe there are like 1.5 tickets left.
Yeah, I think last I checked, we have 3 tickets left. And so there's actually more demand than there is supply, and we're starting to turn to this literally like first come first served kind of situation. But very excited to see it all come together.
Good. All right, let's pivot to the news this week. It's been a slow week for the most part. We might actually get through this entire podcast without mentioning.
Oh, why would you say that?
Without mentioning CrowdStrike, but there we go. I ruined it right off the top.
Come on.
We're through the day hell of Microsoft. Costin, I saw a slide in your deck, and I want to pivot. I want to use it to set up this story. You said in your keynote today, the things we see and know are just a small fraction of what is actually happening around us. That's been a favorite question of mine around APTs over the years. I've asked you this a few times. What percentage of what we actually see and hear about is what's actually active out there? And in the past, your number was, we know 50%
20%.
plus to 20%. Your number kept coming down. I feel like a general theme is our visibility on APTs and high-end malware attacks are very, very limited. What percentage are you at now?
I think there's a couple of sides to this question. And perhaps one of them is who is we? I mean, I think that we as an industry, we are doing a lot more sharing than we used to. So maybe like going back 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot more sharing, and collectively, I think people knew more. There was more information being passed. Nowadays, what do you see? There's a lot of blogs with no IOCs. There's a lot of reporters reporting on stories with no samples, no hashes, nothing. And there's also companies talking a lot more about code names, and they actually talk about the technical details of that attack, like what actually happened. The names are more important than the sample, if you want. So combining this together, I think that collectively we see less than we used to, because there's also a lot less sharing going on, maybe around 5%, I believe. It's also a question of if you're talking about the number of APTs we're seeing, or if you're talking like the total amount of attacks, if you want network CNE, network exploitation that we are seeing, probably we are seeing a lot less, especially on things like mobile, where visibility is very difficult, very scarce, especially on iOS, or network equipment, routers like the core routers running the internet. I think the visibility there is like 0.
Right.
So there could be a lot going on there, and we have no idea.
Juan, we've talked about how marketing there's a big element of marketing here, which is a lot of the NOIOC reports and code names are marketing driven. And we've talked in the past ad nauseum about how it's kind of ruining this threat intelligence industry as a whole. From your perspective, you think that 5% is all we have eyes on? You think there's 95% of real cyber war type, full sophisticated APT type activity that nobody knows about?
I don't know. I think this feels to me like being asked to set like KPIs around doing threat intel, right? Like what quantitative percentage of value have you added? Which may just speak more to like my
Which is an
current.
answer you guys should have.
Well, no, I mean we don't, and it speaks maybe more to my current like corporate traumas than it does to what's actually happening. But uh, it, it's a difficult question for me because it feels like there is no objective answer. What I will say is I think we have a bad tendency to think of technology and technological development as linear. And that is not the case, right? Like you look at the AV technology, there were things that antivirus companies were doing 5, 10 years ago that current EDR companies are not doing. And they were in some ways better. And in some ways, I wish they'd come back. Similarly, when you look at malware and APT hunting, I don't know what makes people think that that is going in a linear sort of development and that we are currently better than we were 5 years ago. That's not necessarily true. At that point, when you talk to me about sort of like our collective visibility, what do we know in comparison to what's out there? How much do we know? Really, what I want to look at is the health of the hunting ecosystem. And I don't know that we're in a very healthy place necessarily, right? It's a consolidated space. We're at a weird time when it seems that the larger market isn't necessarily clear on the ROI, not just of threat intelligence, but information security in general. So, you talk about marketing sort of poisoning things, but I think marketing gets a bad rep in that marketing also enabled a lot of our collective knowledge, right? Like, great,
Funded it, right?
it funded it, it incentivized it to be public, it created conditions. I think it created some of the better conditions that we had sort of back in, before my time, 2012, 2011, when like people were just coming out and saying, look at this amazing thing we found. And it sort of drove the creation of this industry in the private sector. Um, some of that is kind of diminished, and some of the value that was coming from staving off big PR crises is also coming off, and that concerns me because um, neither was a really good measure of whether the information security was worth investing into or whether TI was investing into. But if you also take those away, something that to us is self-evidently valuable is becoming less and less and less apparently valuable to the people that need to invest into it. And I know that's a market answer to a question about visibility, but I think it's really important because I mean, visibility it's not static and it's not linear. There have been times when we have seen more and times when we have seen less. I think that there was a period where 2015, 2016, where I think the answer to your question would have been a far higher percentage than it is now. And I think that's something for us to meditate on, and be particularly concerned with, to the extent of like how important is cyber situational awareness across the board, because it is at a much lower, I think it's at a much lower period than it has been at other times.
Sounds like this man is working on his LABScon keynote, Costin. Right?
But I wanna just give you an example that just came on top of my mind, which is the GIA10, the lib exutils, essentially supply chain attack, which was only a couple of months ago. And typically, just think of WannaCry. The NSA was pretty quick to attribute WannaCry to North Korea. And to date, we haven't seen any kind of public attribution on that. And to me, that is scary. In essence, that was like a huge, huge risk. And the attack was so sophisticated and well designed, only caught by some miracle, let's say. And the fact that we don't have attribution about that just a couple of months later. And that is kind of scary.
Where are you expecting this attribution to come from?
I think it will probably, if it will come from a nation state or potentially at the same time from a nation state and the company, like coordinating the disclosure.
It should have come from GitHub. Like honestly, I pay attention to what
GitHub is owned by Microsoft, no?
Yes, and at some point they had a good threat intel team. I think that kind of dismantled around the time of 3CX, but that's a different conversation to have. But think about it, right? Most of the activity revolving around this happened on their platform. And I'm not, fine. Let's say that there were no OPSEC slip-ups in all of the time that it took. What I had expected to see was not necessarily attribution, but actually lateral discovery. I cannot believe that this was the only project that in a year and a half or however long this person or this unit or this organization was involved in trying to backdoor. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's putting all of your eggs in a single basket for 2 years. That makes no sense. So the fact that no one's been able to come out and say, yeah, and that same IP, those same people, that same account, the same MO, whatever, was also involved in discussions in these 3 other projects. Like that's what I was expecting to see more than the attribution itself. I'm almost certain that is a failure on our part, not a lack of something to discover.
Costin, when you say you're expecting a government and validated with a independent third-party company coming aboard with a report, you're talking about the U.S. government and say Mandiant or like, where are you expecting it from?
Dutch ex machina?
I think the NSA, this is on the NSA's shoulders. I mean, the top agency in the world. I think the NSA should be the one attributing this attack the same way they did it for WannaCry.
All right. We talk about visibility, and this segs perfectly into this story. This Wall Street Journal had this really crazy story, the real story of the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. Did you guys get a chance to see that? Went through in incredible detail, went all the way up to the Prime Minister. One little detail in there that really caught my eye was the fact that the Dutch intelligence agency was the first on the spot to pinpoint the planning and pass this information to the CIA. Now, I bring this up because I've previously saw the Dutch help with the Stuxnet attack, Dutch intelligence. I've seen Dutch intelligence being credited with some pretty significant assistance to Five Eyes. Yet, I have never personally seen a Dutch APT.
That you know of.
Publicly, there is no public documentation of an APT attributed to the Netherlands and the Netherlands government. We've seen France, Spain, everyone else in Europe. Are these guys not on the internet? If they're so good and so amazing, why haven't we found a Dutch APT?
You leave the Dutch alone. There's a reason I made the comment. I made the little joke of Dutch ex machina. I mean, like when you really need a miracle in cyber, what you hope is that the AIVD, the MIVD is just gonna, Kool-Aid man their way into the room with a solution, because that's what seems to happen, right? The DNC hack, they come out like, oh yeah, we were chilling on the cameras of like APT29's facilities, and we can tell you who was sitting at the keyboard when you got popped. Same with this Nord Stream stuff, like who gets Stuxnet into the place. Like they've been referred to me before as what is it, the smallest big country and the biggest small country in Western Europe, right? Like they're this like plucky partner that they ride cowboy, they do awesome shit, and they don't have so many equities at play where they're too shy to tell you what they know, what they think, what they found. So like I'm actually incredibly fond of them. I think they are a sizable cyber power that is completely ignored.
You're not answering my question though. I'll pivot to Costin. How come these guys never get caught? Like they're so good that they never get caught? Like Costin, you've caught them all. Is there first of all, am I missing anything? Is there a public documentation?
Master Costin over here.
Is there public documentation of something that I missed?
They for sure the Dutch intelligence they're mentioned a couple of times, including in the Snowden documents. By the way, I think there's a slide in there that talks about the fact that the NSA needed access to some terrorist forum and they just didn't have. But luckily, I think the Dutch intelligence happened to have a 0 day to help out their NSA brothers, so which is pretty impressive to me, of course, and it also
The
speaks
sixth
to
eye.
the
Why haven't
sixth
we
eye.
caught
I
anything?
think they
Why
do
are
have.
they the most careful? Are they just the most brilliant? Are we just not? Are they being caught and people are not
What makes you
publicly
think that we
documenting it?
would recognize them?
Hmm.
Like I don't think the
That's my
problem
point.
is
If these guys are so good and they're always out front with all these very very big things, you would expect their APTs to be very deeply burrowed in, or are they different? Are they depending more on human sources? Like what is going on?
no, I'm of the belief that we have caught them incidentally in the past and we have not properly attributed it. Like something think about the discussion we were just having about visibility. If we think that visibility over APTs writ large is low, then think about how much of the industry that provides us with insight into APTs is Western and has this like allergic reaction every time it catches a whiff of
Friendly.
Westernness.
The whole
Um,
notion of there are friendlies in cyber.
yeah, which I mean, look, I understand that, but my argument has always been if you're a professional threat intel shop, then you curtail what you want to publish, but you do not curtail what you research. You should know what you're looking at as well as possible regardless of where it comes from. And then you can choose what you want to talk about publicly, where you want to disseminate your information. But there's a truancy and this like bizarre notion of pseudo patriotism that seems to come with the idea that like, oh, it seems Western. Don't touch it. Leave it alone. Don't look at it. It's the fucking Ark of the Covenant. It's like, relax, study this thing. Why haven't we seen it before? What detection should we put in place? How do I keep tracking this thing long term? I'm sorry. Look, I'll put this example forward. We love the Ukrainians and what they're doing and what they're up to. Nobody is reporting on Ukrainian APTs right now other than Positive Technologies and Kaspersky, and they have, sort of their own vested interest there. I
Yeah, but
understand
it
that.
tells us a lot. It tells us a lot about visibility and
Well,
trustworthiness of the data that's out there
it tells you a lot about the willingness to publish. Does that mean we
on
don't
all
see
sides.
them? Does that mean we don't follow up on them? Does that mean we don't put we don't put detections in place or check? No, it should not. If you choose not to put that stuff out there because it's in a war, because the ethical calculus has changed in the time being, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But if you're just looking at it and going, "Oh yeah, no Yara rules, no detections, don't look," you're failing to do your job. And if God forbid tomorrow the Ukrainians decided that they were, going to become the regional superpower in Eastern Europe and start invading other countries, okay, well, maybe you're going to need to figure out how the hell you're going to track this stuff again. And you really shouldn't be waiting for that, for the luck of geopolitics before deciding what you study.
Costin,
So
just to
are
close
you
the loop.
suggesting like trust but Yarify, something like this?
Yeah. No, look, I mean, you should be tracking all of it because at the end of it, catching any APT is like watching, it's like a fucking shooting star just came through, right? Like it's a special moment. You should know why you hadn't seen them before. What are they doing that's special? What are they relying on that's different? And you should prepare for that internally. I don't know why people, I think it's like a scarcity mentality that they think that you see a thing and you have to all of your decisions have to be the same for it. Or so if you found it, if you study it, you must publish it. I don't know. When we were working together, we'd have like 30 APTs in the pipe that we wouldn't even like publish on until later. We decide what to do at a later time, right? You would sit and you would think about it. I don't know if these companies only find one APT at a time, but like I don't think that's the case. Like be mature, study stuff, look at what's cool, and then decide what's worth publishing.
Costin, I think your 5% is going down as we speak. Just to close the
No,
loop, wait one second.
that's
Just to
for
close
sure.
the
Listen,
loop. Okay, go
from all
ahead.
the stories I've heard, and I've heard like so many stories over the years, stories that usually don't make their way into the public at conferences, but you hear them, at the bar after the conference, or you hear them in the back alley, like smoking a
At the
cigar.
hacker bar.
Hacker bar, of course, highly recommended. If you visit Taipei, just go to the hacker bar for good stories and interesting cocktails. By the way, they had the Eternal Blue cocktail. There was
What?
Heartbleed.
Nice.
I'm
There was a
so
0 Day
jealous. Why
cocktail.
can't we have this here? What is this, man?
They even had shisha, like if you can imagine, like shisha for hackers. It did say
Wow.
shisha for hackers.
I would need to go to Taiwan.
To get
I'd
that
like to.
shisha named after Juanito.
But yeah, going back to the rumors. So some of the rumors I heard that in the past, different companies, they did find interesting stuff. They did their best to understand what's that. Is it like something sensitive? Is it like CT or whatever? And they decided to publish, and the effect was not good. Like essentially, they got visited specifically for publishing on Ukrainian APTs. So I guess once you hear these stories and the stories that you kind of get passed over to others,
You
the
censor
desire
yourself.
to expose that essentially goes down.
To
But
close the
you
loop
don't
on the
have to
MIVD
expose it.
thing, is it
Which is
possible at all?
what I'm saying, that probably there's people tracking this stuff, but they don't publish about
I
it.
hope so. I think that's what
Mm,
professionals should do. And I think
mm,
that's what professionals should have done when Equation Group got published. It's what they should have done with everything. It's what you should continue to do. How many times have we caught a new APT because we looked at another APT, wrote some generic signatures,
mhm.
and then it turns out, oh my God, this totally unrelated cluster of stuff was doing something relatively similar. Like
Absolutely.
again, if you're missing that opportunity, I wish I
Mm,
had the time we used to have to just sit there and write signatures on everything. But we would write signatures on everything: a court document, a completely random story. Somebody put out some slides on a thing. There's no sample, whatever. We would just sit there and write rules, and things would pop out, and they weren't even necessarily the things that you were looking for, which made them even more interesting. You're like, somebody's using a similar technique that no one knows what the hell it is. Fascinating. It's just a part of being a professional in this space.
On the absence
fair
of the
enough.
Dutch being caught, is it possible that we've previously attributed something to just like Western or US and it could have been those guys? Is there any sort of like gray area there where that's the reason it's not publicly known?
That's my belief. I am pretty certain we have ran into them before, and I think I know which one, but that's my speculation. Um, but yeah, I don't think it's not that we haven't seen them.
Costin, who else? Who else is active and amazing that we have never caught?
Who else?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. The Japanese, maybe. Like there were like some jokes about that of course there's a code of honor, so the Japanese would never do anything of sorts, and they always kind of relied on the US for their military defense and so on. But yeah, still it's an interesting question, I guess. The Japanese, I don't want to
One,
talk about the countries in Europe,
Yeah.
like I don't know, Liechtenstein or Austria, for instance.
I mean, where are the Swiss? Where are the Norwegians? Where are the Swedes? The Finnish? In theory, they're all probably decently good, right? Like the Polish were pretty legit, and that was a surprising discovery. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there for sure. How much of it is genuinely impressive, we don't know, because it's so few. Like again, what makes the Dutch so amazing is not it's not that they are unbelievable in capabilities, and they may very well be. It does seem like they are fucking awesome, but more than anything, they seem to be willing to leverage the insights that come from cyber uh, with a much lower bar, much lower threshold than most other countries. So they will come out publicly and say, hey, yes, we know that because we were sitting on a box over there. And like no other country seems willing to acknowledge their cyber ops, much less come out and say, we know this because we popped those dudes 2 years ago. Like only the Dutch do that.
If I remember correctly, the Dutch also had a lot more freedom. The Dutch police had a lot more freedom about hacking back and breaking into boxes. I mean, Peter Zinn used to come to SAS conferences and talk about these partnerships. I believe the Dutch law allowed the police to go a lot further than law enforcement in other parts of the world would go. So I imagine that kind of culture exists there, that culture of offense. The former spy chief is now the prime minister. So there's like an
I think
element
their
of...
remit is different, and I think that I know very little, next to nothing about Dutch law, but my understanding is the remit of organizations like the MIVD is just broader. Like you are meant to do more with the information you have access to, and that is a perennial battle with the intelligence community anywhere, but specifically in the United States, where the whole notion of protecting your equities and having long-term access and not interfering in political processes and so on, and having no law enforcement remit, it has made the IC sedentary and complacent in a way where you go, oh yeah, we know stuff about that really important societal problem that's being discussed over there, but no, we would never declassify and provide this information in a way that would become relevant to that. It's much more important that we maintain our access until the end of the universe, even if we are not utilizing that in any meaningful way.
On an intellectual level though, right, the notion of friendlies and not publicizing and not documenting things leaves us in like real dark spot historically about what's really going on though, right? I mean, I had this conversation with Thomas Rid, I believe 2 years ago. We saw the Kaspersky ban coming and everyone kind of knew that this was where we'd go. We'd go to a place where Kaspersky is only doing APTs now on threats they're finding in Russia. And that loss of visibility, the loss of Kaspersky reports, the old great reports, is a loss to the industry as a whole. If everyone starts to do that, like where are we going? Are we just playing the friendly game?
What worries me the most is not just that, but reusing malware, like for false flag purposes, is the thing that I believe is potentially the most threatening. I mean, having, let's say, some malware from high-end APT group just simply getting repurposed and used by a different operator, and then that malware getting ignored because people think that it's actually a friendly. I think that's one of the issues to think about. The other one, of course, is the idea of deconfliction. That I think, Juan, you talked about that a couple of years ago at Virus Bulletin, that the need for deconfliction is quite important. And I don't know, perhaps you can say a few words about that.
I mean, I think the problem of deconfliction is actually super fascinating. The notion of how many
What does it mean?
APTs.
Well, set it up for me.
So deconfliction is a standard military concept about making sure that you don't overlap in your operations in a way that is self-defeating, right? If coalition forces are attacking a position in Afghanistan, if you don't know, for example, that the Brits are entering from the south, you may easily do a bombing run. Or like the Russians have learned this recently in Ukraine, where we shot down a convoy, and then the other Russian troops are like, someone just shot down our convoy, and you go, the Russians just shot down a Russian convoy, right? Like it's a standard military concept. It's also been super problematic in other cases because there's a game theoretical problem there, right? If you're doing covert ops, who do you actually trust to let them know who's there? And I say game theoretical problem because you look at Syria, and the problem that you get into is people didn't necessarily want to tell the Russians where their ops were, or they didn't know who to tell because the Russians were bombing hospitals and they were bombing friendly operations and so on. So it is a really complex game of sort of strategy that goes into deconfliction. When you look at the cyber equivalent of that, what we're talking about is what is your tolerance, what is your threshold of tolerance for existing on the same target, same endpoint, same box as another APT? And keep in mind that this is not the same as warfare, right? You're not going to hear the gunshots. You're not going to know. So do you even know if you're in the same box as another APT? How do you know that? And B, what do you do at that point? To what extent do you have an appetite to coexist? And why that matters is, well, things go aberrant. Things, maybe there's some potential conflict with the malware toolkit of another player. But more importantly, what happens when one very sloppy player comes into the same box? And that's what happened with the famous magnet of threats. What happened with that's the discovery of Equation Group. You have 7 APTs in the same box, and one of them gets discovered, and all of a sudden, you run the gamut of like, well, here's 6 that we know, and who the fuck is this 7th?
It's
So
also why
yeah.
Boldy's territorial dispute find was so incredible, because that also showed this notion of them proactively going and looking for others on the
Boldy's
box.
discovery was phenomenal, and frankly, Silas Cutler and I spent maybe about a year running that discovery down and finding more and more stuff. So there was
Still some unknown things in there.
Oh,
There's still
yeah,
some
yeah.
unfinished work.
Oh, there's a ton of stuff, right? And like even the Fast 16 thing that I revealed at LABScon last year, and never published my paper. I'm so behind. That was a discovery from territorial dispute as well, but also things around this X4L, Shanyan team, the things around Dooku, and there's also other quirks you don't think about, like why are there no territorial dispute signatures for Reagan, right? Like there's a lot of really interesting things in there, but that's a much broader discussion fit for a different forum, I think.
Costin, who owned the magnet of threats computer?
I
Do we
don't
know?
think it was ever pointed or associated with the real world target. So probably it's better for their safety, and being in a country with a terrible human rights history, you don't want to put those people in the spotlight or potentially get them hanged or worse.
No dour magnum over here.
I want to make a connection to another story that I saw yesterday, which was this oil giant Halliburton, who everyone is familiar with, the second largest oil services company in the world, had an incident yesterday. And then it was quickly kind of dismissed as quote-unquote ransomware. And I'm starting to think about the blurring of the lines between what is ransomware, what is APT, what is part of this conversation we're just having around kind of plausible deniability around attacks. And it feels to me like we immediately throw ransomware in a corner as those guys over there not that interesting or not that important. Is that a fair assessment of how we're viewing these things? And should we look at Halliburton acknowledging they had a cyber incident and worry about the larger implications?
I mean, look, we don't know what's happened. And I would suspect even Halliburton isn't entirely aware what happened, right? Like when you get an early report like this, you take it with a grain of salt. I don't know how comforting it is that it is ransomware or not, for the sake of a discussion about APTs, because I'll say this, it's probably ransomware, but it could have, had it been the Iranians, it would have been a phenomenal get on their part. And if it is ransomware, that means that it was a soft enough target where any dedicated APT could have probably gone for it. So, what is the distinction? It's almost like we're looking at our casualties and trying to find comfort in what caliber bullet they got killed with.
If you're a nation state, aren't you using ransomware actors as access brokers? Costin, like, why are we dismissing ransomware? Why are we dismissing it so much as kind of like the same way in the old days we used to dismiss financial crime as like not that interesting? Why is ransomware not that interesting when there's so much?
Yeah, that's actually there's a lot of discussion on this at the moment, partly because I think it was Volt Typhoon that the Chinese government essentially denies that is associated. Instead, they're pointing to a ransomware group. So this kind of mudding
Blurring.
attribution, if you want to, is, let's say, a kind of powerful tool. So it's essentially, I think it's very risky to try to mix APTs and ransomware attacks together unless it really happens. And probably just to speak from a historical point of view, I think the Iranians, probably not the first, but maybe the North Koreans were the ones to pioneer the mix of espionage and ransomware. So first trying to steal as much as possible, and then like let's try to make some money as well, deploying WannaCry 1.0. Maybe even before that, I think I saw some destructive attacks targeting Russia, likely associated with Cloud Atlas. Again, it was kind of ransomware, but in reality it was destructive malware, because even if you paid the ransom, you'd never get the decryption back. So essentially that was essentially destructive malware that we were talking about. So I think this probably is muddying more in the sense that there is an incentive for APT groups if their goal is to sabotage or to cripple their adversaries, then deploying ransomware has some advantages. It can muddy attribution, it can destroy evidence, and it can point fingers into another direction. And that can be very useful if you want to deny the attribution the way I think the Chinese government is doing at the moment.
To that point, particularly with the Chinese, I would point to Alexander Milinkovsky's recent paper on Camel Gang and some of these other groups that he has. He detailed, I think, along with Julian from Recorded Future, they detailed the incidents of Chinese APTs basically wrapping up their operation by deploying ransomware. That distinction, whether it's actual financial motivation or just attempting to foster misattribution, I think it's quite interesting. And we're not really dodging your question, Ryan, as much as like it's not that ransomware is necessarily uninteresting in and of itself, as much as um, it is so abundant that I think that's the point with what used to be financial crime, right? It wasn't that it was uninteresting. The malware could be shit, it could not, but the same thing happens with APTs. You get shitty malware in APTs all the time. It's more that the activity was so widespread and so in your face that for those of us like complexity fetishists who were just looking for the coolest finding we possibly could, you right away you were like, yeah, this is not going to be it. But if you're looking at the dynamics of like initial access brokers and like what's happening, like the ransomware operators, if they are not already an important aspect of the espionage ecosystem of some of these other countries, then they will become. Like, it's ridiculous to think that there's someone in Russian society. There's a subgroup of people in Russian society that are sitting on tens and hundreds of terabytes of exfil data from some of the most valuable Western companies in the world, and that nobody is approaching them to ask for a copy. Nobody is approaching them to leverage that information. That's just fucking stupid.
Correct.
I mean, either they're idiots, which I don't think they are, or we're idiots for deluding ourselves into thinking that that's the case.
At the same time, we have a ransomware epidemic, wealth transfer to Russia. The public narrative is that the Russians are not only turning a blind eye to them, but are protecting these guys. What do you expect if you're a nation state? Aren't you taking advantage of all this data that Juan is just talking about?
You should be.
And Costin, how do we track this? Should we track ransomware and APTs separately? Should we get rid of the term APT altogether? Because these guys are just as advanced and persistent as what we used to describe APT as. Philosophically, is there a larger conversation to be had around now that everything is muddying?
It's probably a multi-dimensional kind of threat matrix, if you want, in which ransomware and nation state are like just two dimensions, because ransomware can be nation state sponsored. I remember there were like some really interesting cases in the past of really advanced stuff hidden as ransomware. I think one of them was a research that was put out by Kaspersky a couple of years ago. I think it was called Striped Fly. And that was some pretty interesting stuff, which bundled their own Tor, custom Tor client, like inside the malware, but also there was a kind of custom ransomware as well. And it's like this super strange story of how they hit, I think, an entity in Taiwan with that particular ransomware. And then the attackers kind of apologized and they provided the decryption keys. So it was like a very, very weird story there. But there are gems, if you want. There are gems like that where multi-dimensional situations can happen with ransomware intermixing into nation-state sponsored operations, and I believe that will happen more. There's been quite a few discussions today at HitCon about freelancers, especially freelancers working for North Korea, China, Russia. So let's say in the case of North Korea, that's just regular people who do their duty to the country. They steal cryptocurrencies, and the country provides a method to exchange that into goods and services they can take actually advantage in their own country with zero risk. So I would assume that this kind of a framework that maybe North Korea is pioneering can also work in other countries as well. Russia, of course, China, and so on.
There's several points there worth mentioning. On the use of ransomware for other, blended operations and like completely different purposes. Let's not forget the really obvious example of the Iranians attacking the Albanian government with quote unquote ransomware in order to exact some kind of retribution about the MEK and this whole situation with Israel. That one was fascinating. I would also point out, I think, to your point, Ryan, the issue is twofold. Our tracking of ransomware actors is shitty. Like it is not granular enough. We talk about ransomware groups, and we usually use the brand of the ransomware group or the malware as a service provider or whatnot. Whereas in reality, most of the operations that we're talking about should be tracked at an affiliate level. That's where you would know who did the hacking, who did the infection vector, who did the collection, and then who deployed the ransomware. And the ransomware that affiliate deploys on Tuesday is not necessarily the same ransomware that affiliate deploys on Thursday. So we need to have better granular tracking of these crews. And shout out to really Microsoft and Mandiant for being the best at actually tracking some of these affiliates rather than getting lost in tracking ransomware quote unquote groups. And not everybody has the granular visibility to do that. At the same time, I would push back on a naive perception of the role of language in what we do. And I point that at the people who are pissy about how we name APTs, and I would point that at the discussion about whether APT is really valuable or not. From a theoretical object of study, it is not a valuable term, it's an inaccurate term. But that is a kind of autistic naivete about what we use language for, the same way that I think Dmitry Alperovich and some of these other folks who insist on, like, well, we should just call them what they are, right? If APT 29 is the SVR, then just say it's the SVR. Again, not necessarily a one-to-one equivalence, but also underestimating the role of language. Calling something an APT is a euphemism, and it's an inaccuracy from the start. It used to mean the Asia Pacific threat, and it got whitewashed literally into something far more palatable. But the whole point of it has always been to give us an inane, boring, pedantic way to talk about something that's so interesting that if we called it what it is, most companies would never publish on it. Most people would never be comfortable talking about it. None of us would ever get permission to go to a conference to actually talk about it. Like, there is a political role that is enabled by playing dumb. So while I agree with any conversation that says, oh, we should just retire the term, sure, but you better come up with some other Mickey Mouse bullshit way to talk about espionage and nation state meddling if you think that Google and Microsoft and Facebook and everybody else is going to be perfectly comfortable publishing blogs every Tuesday and Thursday.
I feel you on that. Chris Bing and Reuters has a new story out today. Just reporting on the U.S. government's confirmation that the Iranians were behind the compromise of the Trump campaign. We tried to touch on this last week, but Juan went off on a tangent on MTAC or whatever it is that we never even got to the substance of the conversation. The thing that stood out here for me, Costin, is this: they're describing here APT42, this charming kitten, which is completely different from what Microsoft documented, this Mint Sandstorm thing.
Oh, it's so tricky. So I don't think that APT42 is charming kitten.
Oh Jesus!
But that's like again we're going into this very crazy direction.
That's
it's
your
like
rabbit
the
hole.
attribution jungle of APT names. That it's a subset of that is actually seen by the different company as a superset of whatever. But I think that this is in my opinion the most interesting thing is that they're calling it APT42, which thanks to Mandiant we know what that is. And the Microsoft blog that was talking about was it Mint Sandstorm? And I think the last time
APT35, right, which is something completely different.
Yeah, maybe we don't know. But we were talking the last time that what is Mint Sandstorm? Is it APT35? Is it APT42? The fact that the government is saying it was APT42 in particular, I think that's really really nice and it's good attribution. And we need more of that, specifically, I think, from the government, from the NSA, whoever, to just step up and say it is exactly this thing. And then people, can do more hunting, they can collect more IOCs, and then they can talk about the same threat actor, knowing that they actually have an idea what they're talking about. So I think that's a nice story.
What is APT42, and why is it? Why is that connection interesting?
I think it's interesting because Iran is such a colorful hacking scene, if you want. And there's like so many different groups that have been active over the years coming from there. And they're associated with different entities, different intelligence organizations, essentially, in Iran. So very few of them, I think, they're associated with the organization known as MOIS, which is the Civilian Intelligence Agency, and a lot of them are associated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, known as IRGC. So that is interesting because, like we also see from other countries, military and civilian intelligence agencies, they operate in different ways, and they generally have access to different tools. And they also have different interests, like which are, for instance, in case of Russia, we see these notable differences, let's say, between APT29 and APT28, and or Turla or Gamma Radon, all essentially associated with the FSB. So from this point of view, it's interesting to know that in particular IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, are the ones working on the U.S. Elections and interested on this particular topic. So that's why I think it matters, in my opinion.
Oh, Juan, if we go by the maxim that we only know about 5% of what's actually happening, is it fair to suggest that there's a lot more election interference hacking activity happening that hasn't come out yet? Or do you think this is...
So here's the problem with this activity and the way that we're talking about it. There is a difference between hacking election-related targets and election interference. And that is a really, really important... No. Election interference is an action.
That follows the hacking.
That follows the hacking, but it is not an action that always follows the hacking of an election target. I'm sure the
hacking is for the express purpose, though.
No, you don't know that. That's the thing.
Okay.
We don't know that. I'm sure the U.S. has hacked plenty of, let's say, political parties in Taiwan or in China and whatever. Well, actually, China. Look, the U.S. has hacked plenty of political parties and election-adjacent organizations in the past and has not leveraged that information towards election interference per se. I'm sure everyone has done that at some point or another. It is part of the same kind of collection that you would do, for example, to find out what the political agenda of a potential president could be. That doesn't mean that you're looking to interfere with an election. Election interference is a different action, the same way that sabotage is a different action that you would take in the aftermath of a cyber operation and the same kind of access. And that's really what makes things like the Talon Manual so hard to define, and all this like political, not just like cyber policy, but also international law around cyber, so hard to get right. Cyber operations work in a sort of like continuum, and the access that would eventually turn into a potential sabotage operation isn't necessarily a part of that same operation. So like
Fair.
my point being that I think I would be surprised if these were the only APTs that have hacked the Trump campaign, let's say.
Fair.
And I think what we find reprehensible is the leveraging of that data and that access to carry out, mass manipulation, disinformation operations, trying to sextort or leverage some other kind of blackmail material, compromise. Like those are the things you find objectionable. But you got to be really careful about classifying any access to these people as the same thing.
Costin, do we generally underrate the Iranians? And when it comes to these kinds of operations, I feel like every time they're thrown out there, they're like ransomware. We kind of dismiss them. Is that a fair?
I think there's for sure a lot of the narrative and what people are talking about is shaped. This is not something that happens randomly, if you want. Like this is one of the things that I learned many years from Kim Zetter, which is that everybody has an agenda. So whenever you publish something, you have an agenda. As a security company, whenever you publish something, you have an agenda. It can be like you want to do some marketing, get more exposure, maybe help an ally, or on the contrary, expose an adversary. So I think the narrative, the narrative that we are hearing most of the time was focused a lot on Russia, was focused a lot on China recently, but maybe less in Iran. I mean, historically, Israeli threat intelligence companies, they've been very active talking about Iranian threats, publishing constantly, muddy water, like APT certified. A lot of reports have come out over the years and getting generally a very good grip on what they're doing. But on a global scale, the narrative is not that, at least not at the moment. Probably it may change in the future if they are deemed kind of a worthy adversary. But I mean, if you look even at the way they try to influence the elections, perhaps that was not the smartest thing. And it also kind of showed a kind of lack of experience. Just imagine if they actually did this in a different way. Maybe hire kind of lobbyist and just to present those documents to the other party and then expose the whole thing that somebody presented those documents to the other party. I mean, that would be like a much bigger story than the fact that journalists...
If they only had WikiLeaks, Julian Assange sitting in the middle of that dissemination,
WikiLeaks, I think that there may be still novices and learning and trying to understand. And this is why I believe it's important to keep an eye, like to learn and to watch them carefully as they are becoming better and better. And this is like general trend everywhere, that everyone's getting better at disinformation and influencing of public opinion. Activity, for instance, here in Taiwan is huge from the Chinese side, trying to compromise politicians to make them look bad. All of that is very, very powerful, and you can see
I'm
that.
I'm surprised they're even allowing this conversation to happen on their internet.
If my connection goes down unexpectedly, you know who it was. It was a Dutch.
Okay. You want to pivot perfectly to the last topic, and we don't have a lot of time, but I really do want to touch on it before the story gets stale next week. Is a story I saw on hackhunting.com about Xiaomi doing some patching shenanigans ahead of Patch Tuesday ahead of Pon2Own in Toronto. Costin, you can sit out this one if you're worried about your internet going out. But
when I read the story, that felt like a very kind of a Romanian thing to do. Like, and I'm saying that because I've seen this happen before. Like, I won't give any names, but it felt like so natural to me to reading that. And so, yeah, look, the Chinese are kind of Romanian, a little bit, if you
They
want.
But
can
let me
aspire to be.
set it up, because this actually happened that Pwn to Own gave them the prize for the lamest vendor response. And the idea was that Xiaomi was disabling parts of its infrastructure, including the global app store, to stop these Pwn to Own contestants from winning. But the biggest, the hidden in there is kind of like a suggestion that ZDI, which runs the Pwn to Own competition, is either compromised, or there's some sort of insider leaking information to the hackers as part of the contest, because it was kind of like a cat and mouse, day by day, back and forth of Xiaomi disabling certain things. And then at the end of it all, Xiaomi kind of like unpatched the entire system to push a bigger patch later on with a CVE crediting someone else, which like it's so weird, these shenanigans happening. But buried in there is a suggestion that ZDI may be compromised. Does that worry you, Juan? ZDI is a broker for
You
every
don't
big
think
zero day.
CDI, like, come on, man, like,
You think they've been compromised already by the Dutch?
you leave the Dutch alone, right? They're the badasses of the whole picture, and I wish everybody behaved the way the Dutch do. No, I think we think too little of our adversaries. If you are telling me that there are these giant bank vaults full of 0 days, and that none of these people would try to break into those vaults. And like CDI might be like the flimsiest external one. I would think the same way about wherever it is that Microsoft holds its vulnerabilities database,
HackerOne, Bug
and
Crowd. I mean,
HackerOne,
let's call
Bug
it. Yeah.
Crowd. But no, but look, HackerOne, Bug Crowd, CDI, they're external, trifling, like more like smaller targets on the outside. What is, for example, the mystery of orange size vulnerabilities getting leveraged by Hafnium before they were patched? Like, there is a mystery there about, well, how did the Chinese know about this vuln that had already been reported by a Taiwanese researcher to Microsoft, that was getting, they were getting ready to patch it, but they weren't quite there. How did they get it? And one of the discussions to have is, well, were they in Microsoft? Which doesn't seem all that implausible now, I'll tell you that. But like, why, as a nation state that sources 0 days, that spends a fuck ton of money trying to get your arsenal in place, you're not going to try to hack into where confirmed vulnerabilities live? That's ridiculous. You have to prove otherwise, as far as I'm concerned.
Costin?
I just realized why the Dutch are never attributed. That's because nobody can pronounce their names. Like you cannot attribute that.
This is just, I hate to say this, but like, there is this kind of like merman underwater quality to listening to the Dutch speak. I hate to say, I love these guys. I really don't want to talk shit at all, but it is a very disconcerting. Like, the language is not, it's unrelatable. I cannot.
Nobody
get
can
past that.
except the Dutch.
The underlying thing here, though, is that how we closed the podcast last week about the balkanization of tech is the Chinese are eventually going to kick iOS out of their government networks and so on, and Xiaomi is going to be the one of the alternatives for use internally in China, and the ability and they have big motivation to duck headlines about Pwn to Own age and all this stuff. So like, this stuff is super important to them. I saw Dakota
that's
Carey
great.
make a point on Twitter that, like, to us this sounds like these guys are just joking around and playing around cat and mouse games. To those guys, it's almost like life and death. Because
I don't
of
think
how
that's
these
a
things are
bad thing, Ryan. We should encourage them to do that. iOS is way too hard on the platform. Please go ahead, transition to Xiaomi, who doesn't actually have a vested interest in improving their, like, raising the level of their platform to that. Like, similarly, the Russians, if you are dying to embrace Kaspersky OS or whatever other bullshit local operating system, go right ahead. It's going to be a wonderful time. You know how much easier a time American vulnerability researchers are going to have with some bullshit platform that, like, doesn't have the same level of, like, hardware software coordination, it doesn't have the same level of, like, inspectability and visibility and so on? No. So personally, yeah, if the Chinese want to do that, I have a feeling that the Dutch and everybody else are going to have a wonderful time with it. Why not?
This is true. This is the question we ask about tech balkanization is what are they going to use? You kick iOS and Android out of your country. What do you use? You use this thing that is half baked, less likely to be as secure and looked at as iOS or Android. Is that fair, Costin?
Yeah, you'll use a homegrown solution, Red Star OS, MS-DOS, DR-DOS, OS2 Warp, like one of my favorite operating systems, which until a couple of years ago was still running the Romanian underground system. So yeah, I'll have to use one of these solutions. I still use FAR, yeah.
Come on, FAR is a way of life. It's different.
FAR, Hue, and RAR, in my opinion, are the three most useful tools ever produced in computing.
I still give Hue licenses to my students at Hopkins.
Wow.
And I think I'm the only person buying that shit. But I love it.
There.
I remember that I used to have an old laptop of mine, had the like one of these old LCDs displays that was actually burned to FAR. Like when it was turned off, you could see the FAR burns in the LCD.
Awesome. That's right, kids. FAR Manager, Hue, go 1990s Eastern European hacker. It's the only way to really get into this space. That's where you get your creds.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We've made it to episode 10 next week. We have a new podcast logo with our handsome devilish faces on the thing. We have a new logo for the folks listening to us on Apple's operating system. It would be cool if you go into your podcast platform and give us a vote, leave a review. Apparently, the kids tell me there's some algorithm that helps.
You're getting so corporate with this, man.
Yeah, like and subscribe,
Smash that like button, kids.
Smash that like button.
I just realized that Oppenheimer learned Dutch in 2 weeks. So, yeah, there's still
what's our excuse? What's our fucking excuse?
Exactly.
God damn it.
Goodbye, folks.
Пока.